Good afternoon, everyone. This is another, I would say, very exciting and interesting, and yet another first, I think, for our community and ASTP. First on several levels. Not first using this platform, which some of you may be familiar with, the AirMeet format, so that hopefully works very well. But it's certainly a first to invite a very illustrious panel, championed a team of all sorts of experts from lots of backgrounds who will be introduced themselves. You'll have seen the agenda for this afternoon, so I'm not going to go into any detail. But really delighted that Physiological Society, based in the UK, reached out to say, listen, we've been doing really interesting work all about knowledge exchange and how about the interface and engagement with the different academic disciplines. And so the report that they've put together, which we're going to hear a lot more about this afternoon, is a really excellent, I would say it's an excellent community tool that we're really looking forward to hearing about. We've got this afternoon all together, and the session, as well as a number of panelists. We're delighted that Adrian Day is going to actually act as a moderator and keep an eye on the questions and comments, which, as you know, you can pop in the chat space and will be picked up during the course of the afternoon. We also have the capacity at the end of the plenary session with the panel to go into the lounge area. There's a little button on the top right-hand corner that will appear at the appropriate moment, where if you are willing and interested to stay around for a little bit longer to either talk to some of the panelists who might still be around or anybody else who's in the audience, then we can break out into little tables where you'll actually see and hear one another at the tables. So that's also a feature that we might make use of later on this afternoon, depending on how much plenary chit chat and how successful the whole session is for the first hour and a half and how much ground we cover. And I think the final comment I'd make this in is also that we're very delighted again that this particular combination of people, this topic, the Physiological Society and what's going on, is also going to be very visible because they are going to be part of the platform when we have our digital annual conference as the SE at the end of May. So in fact, they're coming on board as one of our sponsors, which means that they will have a dedicated booth and a digital space for all sorts of discussions and meetings and networking, and that's what we really look forward to. So as I say, this is a first for this type of panel discussion. It's the first with this particular topic and combination, but it certainly isn't the last. So hopefully the start of a beautiful friendship, I think, and lots of exciting chit chat. So some familiar faces to me. I'm really looking forward to hearing it, and I will say absolutely no more just now. I'm delighted to hand over to Adrian and the rest of the group. So many thanks everyone for your time this afternoon, and we'll catch up later. Thank you, Adrian.
Great stuff, very many thanks. I mean, literally, we want to thank you very much for hosting us here. On behalf of the Physiological Society and the National Centre for University Business, who were the key sort of organisations behind the report, and indeed Pat Sorrell, who spent a lot of time working with us all the way through. The bit of background really about this is the fact that the Physiological Society was looking at the issue of sort of healthy aging, which is, of course, one of the grand challenges, not just for the UK, but again, something which I think all developed economies are certainly facing as being a challenge, an issue. And it's not something which can be fixed by any one single intervention, any one single discipline. But we know that physiology is a big part of what we're going to be doing to make sure that there are healthier, happier years for the population. So that was particularly, I think, the idea of saying, well, we want to find out a bit more about exactly what physiologists are doing. So the twofold approach was to look at some data, the quantitative stuff. Obviously in the UK have a pretty established system called the Higher Education Business and Community Interaction Survey, which measures knowledge exchange across a number of indicators. So we sort of reached out to a number of institutions we knew were active in physiology. We thought we'd pick people who have the most to gain, if you like, to ask them to spend some time with us to sort of estimate of their KE metrics, of the amount of knowledge exchange they're doing every year. What proportion of those are sort of linked to physiology? Not necessarily directly, it's a bit, but they're where are things basically happening because there was a physiologist involved somewhere. And again, the other part of it was to look at the quality of element, to base some work on the survey of academics done by Alan Hughes et al. In 2015 by the National Centre for University Business, to basically ask people, what are the kind of things you do and why do you do them, and what are the enablers, what are the barriers, what can we do to help as such. So the report basically gives you a sense saying, actually, there's a lot of what goes on in knowledge exchange in certain universities actually really does come down to or rely on physiology. as one particular discipline we particularly looked at. And again, we found that the physiologists themselves are very active across the spectrum, both in terms of licensing and contract research, but right through to public engagement and student engagement and so forth. So there's been a sort of wealth of understanding that we're still kind of picking through in terms of the data. And we've got a number of recommendations we've made, both for institutions, for the government, and for ourselves, in terms of what we think we can do next to sort of really build on what we've learned here. But I don't spend too much time getting into detail. I really could spend the whole session talking about it. And if people are particularly interested in the mechanisms, then do please sort of put some questions in, and perhaps we can talk about it in the side or afterwards. But I want to get onto the panel, because they are the really interesting people, and they've actually got the best bits of details to put across to you. I will let them introduce themselves, just because I think that's probably the make sure I don't miss anything out on the way through. And hopefully we'll have a fairly seamless transition. It's a brilliant system that we've got here, but it's all the first time we're sort of using it properly. So do bear with us if there's a slight little hiccup in transition here and there. Two of the speakers have slides, otherwise we'll be sort of face-to-face as such. And like I say, do please drop questions in the chat on the way through, or save until the end as you prefer. And hopefully we'll have a really interesting conversation. First up, I think, will be Tam from Praxis Oral. So I will say over to you, Tamsin.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Adrian, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. It's really nice to be here with the Physiological Society, who I've been working with as part of their working group for this project for the last year or so, but also to be on an ASTP platform, because Praxis Oral is the UK's national association for KE practitioners. I'm head of policy at Praxis Oral and was previously a KE practitioner myself. And Praxis Oral and ASTP have a long history, so it's really nice to be here today representing Praxis Oral. And it seems really appropriate that we're here talking about disciplinary-based approaches to knowledge exchange, because one of the most recent collaborations we've done with ASTP has been thinking about knowledge exchange for the arts, humanities and social sciences. That's a course that's run 2-3 times now in the recent past. And that really arose from a similar kind of need to understand that if we were going to engage more academics across the academy broadly, we needed to start thinking outside traditional tech transfer-oriented knowledge exchange models. That there was a whole part of the academy that didn't necessarily think about patents when they were doing knowledge exchange. So this course was developed to look beyond that model and to think about how we incentivize and motivate more researchers to take part in knowledge exchange. Our training, of course, was for the brokers, many of whom had had some experience in developing that kind of relationship and expertise with arts, humanities and social sciences. But there are similar themes here, not least in terms of capacity at knowledge exchange offices, and thinking about how the skills and the knowledge that we provide our members with as a training organisation related to other parts of the academy. Another approach to a kind of disciplinary-based discussion around knowledge exchange, which is mentioned in the review, was a review done in 2018 into mathematics. It's called The Era of Mathematics. It's called the Bond Review. That was released in 2018, and that was a bit more what we might call supply-side driven. It was partly in response to discussions at the time around the UK's industrial strategy and the associated challenge funding that went with those. There were various challenges, notably around life sciences, for example, of which the healthy ageing is part. And the mathematician community felt that they weren't particularly well represented in those conversations. And if you're not well represented in a conversation, it generally means you don't benefit from funding at the end of the day. So that was an effort to raise awareness of what they were doing, and also to quantify the amount of activity, the amount of knowledge exchange activity and relevant research that was already going on in that base, highlighting contribution. So Praxis Oral wasn't directly involved in that report, but one of the outcomes from that report, which I think is worth noting in this context, was that Dr. Joanna Jordan, who was working as a math KE practitioner, a KE broker, I think at Bath or Bristol University, she actually achieved the RTTP status for her work in that area. So you can see how that links back into something that matters a lot to Praxis Oral. So the Physiological Society report, I think, takes elements of both of those, because practitioners were very much involved in talking about the kind of work they were doing with physiological disciplines in their own universities. It also, of course, talked to researchers and listened to them about kinds of knowledge exchange activities they were involved in, and thought about the barriers and the motivations and incentives. And it's gone a step further than that, because it's brought everything together. And that's why we're all here on this platform today. And Adrian's talked about the metrics, which again is a new approach. And it was really interesting to see how these very broad sector metrics that we're also used to talking about in the UK and using to kind of describe our activity and to quantify knowledge exchange. Well, for all their great, the great points about the HEPSI data set, it's a pretty imprecise set of inputs and outputs, and you don't actually know a great deal about where that knowledge exchange actually arises, certainly not in terms of discipline. We want to be careful here, because I don't think of us want to see a disciplinary based HEPSI data set or a knowledge exchange framework, which is just launched in the UK, of course. But if professional societies like the Physiological Society can help us to understand better the types of knowledge exchange that's going on, that's underpin those metrics, then I think that's a really worthwhile exercise. For Praxis Oral, it helps us to be involved in different conversations. It helps us to bring more awareness of knowledge exchange to a different set of researchers. It helps KE offices to think how they might respond to the needs of that particular research area. It makes them think differently, possibly, about the external opportunities and where they might take a company or another type of organisation within the academy approach to resolve a particular challenge or so on. So there's that very important education piece. We know that knowledge exchange is rarely linear, so it's important to have an open mind when somebody comes with a particular challenge. And I think it's all about making more of our metrics and having a more nuanced approach to knowledge exchange, which is certainly, I think, something we're seeing happening in the UK, where we've now got a pretty mature knowledge exchange activity after 20 years of dedicated funding for knowledge exchange. There's more and more nuance hanging around the types of disciplines involved, and happening on the demand side too, in terms of thinking differently about different types of companies. So for me, I'm just going to talk, I haven't got slides obviously, so I'm just going to talk briefly about the four main learning points I felt came out of this report for us. The first one was about building that evidence base. I mean, this is so important to the work I do in policy at Praxis Oral, because there's always this constant question of what success looks like and what good looks like in knowledge exchange, and it's very it's very much about quantifying activity, but we do need that qualitative story as well. We need more narratives about what knowledge exchange is taking place and who's involved. We need more granularity so that funders and policymakers can think about what levers to apply if we're going to increase the amount of knowledge exchange we're doing. We can't just keep going to the usual suspects, whether that's in the research base or whether it's in external organisations. The second point is about better understanding academic motivation and incentives, and also barriers for knowledge exchange. Are they the same across all disciplines, or are there differences from other disciplinary groups? I think we found that there certainly were differences when we looked at arts, humanities and social sciences. That was partly to do with the language of knowledge exchange itself, and this assumption that you had a patent and you did something with it, and it was, there was a more linear type of route to market. But it's surprising how infrequently we actually hear from the research community when we talk knowledge exchange. We tend to talk a lot to businesses about what they want from universities, and universities kind of get lumped together as a single unit where no two are the same, and they all have different kinds of specialisms and strengths and weaknesses. So it is really important that we talk about that kind of supply side as well as that demand side as well, and considering how to broaden our narrative. But thirdly, there was also a lot of learning on the demand side in this report. I knew very little about Physiological Society and its members when we started on this project, and I've learned a lot, and been really delighted to see how often it is relevant to not just in more obvious fields like sports or healthy aging, but as we've gone through the COVID crisis, it's made me think how often that kind of that type of research is relevant. So this is understanding that where we might apply that demand within our institutions, I think is important, about changing perceptions for knowledge exchange brokers about what's in scope when it comes to answering external challenges and questions. And it's about diversity. Diversity is a very important topic that certainly at Praxis Oral we're going to be addressing over the next couple of years. Diversity amongst our KE practitioner base, diversity in terms of university types, but also diversity in terms of just going beyond the usual suspects when we're talking about knowledge exchange, and really seeking out other people who might not put themselves to go for particular opportunities, but who have very valid impact to make through their research. And that really brings me on to my fourth point, last but not least, certainly, which is Praxis Oral's bread and butter, which is training and development of skills. And the big question is, do we need specialisation when it comes to training for knowledge exchange? And do we need specialised skills to address particular disciplinary areas, or indeed industrial sector areas? Are specialisms really so special? And I think this report says both yes and no. For me, there are certainly very common issues that we see coming through these conversations when we do drill down a bit further, whether that be into the social sciences and issues around commercialisation, whether it's into this particular disciplinary base. Maybe, in fact, there's more common issues on the barriers to knowledge exchange, where everybody's working in the same type of research culture in the UK, and lack of time to participate in knowledge exchange is quoted again and again as a barrier to more participation. So that's certainly a common conversation we can have. And even if brokers do need a common set of skills and a common set of know-how to do knowledge exchange, I think there is great value in having a greater range of contexts in which to apply those skills and that know-how. And that's where I suppose a report like this is so valuable to our members, because they can see other types of knowledge exchange happening and think about whether their toolkit is fit for the purpose. Whether that's thinking about the types of resources that they have in their team, or whether it's they have the right models for treatment of IP of different kinds. We can't cater for every research area clearly, but I think if we can bring in more case studies, more voices, more champions for different types of engagement, then that will make our work so much richer. So I think this has been a really valuable exercise. I think we'll probably see more of this type of deep dive in the future, which will be really interesting, and we'll just keep building our understanding of knowledge exchange and the kinds of skills and know-how that we need to do it, and the type of activity that we can encourage and support. I'm sure it's the same for ASTP members as it is for Praxis Oral. Post-COVID, our universities are at the centre of this desire to renew and to build back better, as the British government puts it, post-COVID. And at Praxis Oral, our aim is to make ours as well equipped as they possibly can be to help researchers to do that, and help other parts of the university to do that, and bring them together with external organisations, so that we can achieve these ambitious targets that we've got to there's now. So thank you for having me. I will stop now and I think I'm handing over to Tim next, and he's going to talk about his experience as a researcher in this area. But I'm also very happy to sit down and answer some questions later.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Curtis, and I'm Chair of Vascular Physiology and one of the Deputy Directors at the Wellcome-Wolfson Institute for Experimental Medicine at Queen's University of Belfast. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just give you an academic perspective on knowledge exchange. So initially, I'm going to focus on my own background and experience of knowledge exchange. And then in the second part of the talk, I want to really talk a bit more about the Physiological Society and NCUB knowledge exchange report that Adrian and Tasmin have already introduced, but look at it more from an academic perspective and highlight some of the enablers and barriers to knowledge exchange that were identified. So I'm based in the Wellcome-Wolfson Institute for Experimental Medicine in Belfast. It's a fairly large research institute. We've got about 52 research groups and around 300 scientists, and that includes our postdoctoral researchers and postgraduate students. And the institute focuses on major diseases in the ophthalmology, respiratory medicine, cardiovascular, and infection and immunity areas. So we have a number of ongoing projects at the moment based around COVID-19. On the right-hand side, I've included a chart that really just gives an overview of the different sources of grant income to the Institute. And I really only included this to make the industrial collaborations constitute a significant proportion of our research activities. And in fact, over the last 3 years, we've initiated 30 projects with 24 different biopharma companies. In terms of my own laboratory interest, well, my early scientific training was as a microvascular physiologist, so I was interested in how the smallest blood vessels in the body work. And while I was keen to continue research in this area when I was appointed to my first academic post, I also wanted to start applying some of the knowledge and expertise that I had gained into better understanding disease. And so this led me to focus my research lab around a disease called diabetic retinopathy. And this is one of the leading causes of moderate and severe vision loss worldwide. And it's caused by diabetes damaging the very tiny blood vessels at the back of the eye, as you can see in this fundus image here. So over the last 20 years, my laboratory has not only been looking at how these very tiny blood vessels in the eye function under normal circumstances, but we've also been trying to understand how diabetes damages those blood vessels. And in fact, more recently, we've been able to expand the lab further to include development and testing of new therapeutics for the treatment of this disease. So where have the knowledge exchange opportunities arisen from then within my own laboratory? The industrial collaborations within my own laboratory and also those of colleagues who also work within this area have come out of our scientific knowledge and expertise in diabetic retinopathy, but also the broad range of model systems that we have in place in order to study this disease preclinically. And these industrial partnerships have come through a number of routes, through networking at conferences, through us engaging with academia, industry partnering organizations, and also through the companies directly contacting us. So that's a very brief overview of my background and experience in knowledge exchange. What I want to do for the remainder of this, for the next 5 minutes, is really talk a bit more about the Physiological Society and NCUB knowledge exchange report that was published in January and that I helped to co-chair. And as I said, I'm going to look at this more from an academic perspective, in particular focusing on some of the drivers and barriers to knowledge exchange that were highlighted by the physiologists that participated in this project. I should point out that the report itself is available to download directly from the Physiological Society and NCUB websites. Before I get into that, though, I want to just highlight as well, as part of the report, we also wanted to try to quantify the value of physiology's contribution to knowledge exchange activity within the UK. And of the UK higher education institutions that contributed data, we found that an average of 11% of their overall knowledge exchange activity was related to physiology. So it's quite a significant proportion of the knowledge exchange activity that's going on within the UK universities can be linked to the physiology discipline, at least for the universities that we surveyed. So to study the enablers and constraints that are faced by physiologists when trying to engage in knowledge exchange activity, the Physiological Society surveyed its membership over the summer of 2020. And the survey that was used was essentially a simplified version of the Hughes 2015 survey that Adrian mentioned at the beginning of this session. And of course, that Hughes 2015 survey formed the basis of one of the largest ever surveys of UK academic knowledge exchange activity with external organisations. In terms of our results, well, we found that physiologists valued knowledge exchange most for the positive contributions it could make to their own research. And they also valued knowledge exchange as an important way of translating their science into real-world application. And certainly from my own perspective, that's been a major motivation behind my own knowledge exchange activities with industry. The industrial collaborations that I've been involved in to date have enabled me to access expertise that isn't directly available within my own institute, particularly around drug development, but perhaps more importantly has allowed me to begin to bring my preclinical diabetic retinopathy work closer to clinical translation. And interestingly, engaging in knowledge exchange activity as a source of personal income was by far the least cited enabler within the physiology community. With regards to barriers to knowledge exchange, there's perhaps no surprise that lack of time was by far the most cited top 3 barrier. And in fact, this is very much in line with the HEIs 2015 survey that obviously surveyed a much broader range of academics. But as an academic myself, I actually think this barrier is perhaps more reflective of the extent to which knowledge exchange activity is factored into criteria for career progression, with a lot of academics choosing to prioritize other activities. Difficulty in identifying partners and lack of sufficient training and skills in knowledge exchange were also perceived as significant barriers. And we'll hear later from Marcus Koester from Boehringer Ingelheim about how they've managed to go about helping industry and academia break down the barrier of identifying partners. Now, one of the really interesting findings that came out of the report was that we found that fewer physiologists reported direct benefits to their research and teaching resulting from their knowledge exchange activity than in the original HEIs 2015 survey. And I think this particular data really highlights where a discipline-specific analysis of knowledge exchange activity can help to pinpoint certain factors that might be influencing knowledge exchange activity within certain cohorts or groups of academics. So just finally then, within the report, a number of recommendations were made in terms of how we can go about helping physiologists overcome some of the barriers that were identified. And recommendations were made not only to government, but also to higher education institutions and learned societies. And a lot of these recommendations, I think, are generally applicable across various subject areas. So one of the key recommendations of the report was that higher education institutions should make sure they embed knowledge exchange into their culture. And I know that is the case in a lot of UK universities now, but in particular, they should ensure that criteria around academic progression recognizes successful knowledge exchange activities. It's obviously important that academics have access to professional knowledge exchange support, and that support and training is available for academics in terms of conducting knowledge exchange activities. And I think this latter point around support and training, we feel it's very important that that's targeted towards mentoring and upskilling early career researchers. But of course, the learning societies also have a very important role to play here, particularly in helping to break down discipline-specific issues. And so the Physiological Society are currently considering a number of recommendations that were made within the report, including establishing a network of physiology knowledge exchange academic champions across the UK. And the role of those academic champions would be to help promote opportunities for knowledge exchange within the discipline, and also begin to make strides towards tackling some of the barriers that are faced by physiologists when engaging in knowledge exchange. The Society are also considering other recommendations, such as establishing knowledge exchange fellowships to alleviate time barriers, as well as developing resources, again, targeted towards trying to address some of the discipline-related issues. So I think with that, I'm going to finish there, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions at the end of the session.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcus Koester. I'm Director of Discovery Research Coordination of Boehringer Ingelheim. And this afternoon, I have the privilege and pleasure to introduce to you the approach that my company has selected in order to address knowledge exchange, to reach out to partners from the academic environment. A few words about the company itself, because not all of you may be actually familiar with Boehringer Ingelheim, although it actually belongs to a top 20 pharmaceutical player worldwide, with a considerable amount of employees working worldwide, who generate last year up to 19 billion net sales in the areas of human pharmaceuticals, animal health, and biopharmaceutical contract manufacturing. Of those, quite a considerable proportion is reinvested in research and development. In fact, the company is highly interested in reaching out to external experts when it comes to discovery, to knowledge, because I think now over a decade ago, the company, in the same way as other pharmaceutical companies, has discovered that actually relevant knowledge and discoveries happen outside the company, and that therefore the company needs to open up and provide an environment in which knowledge exchange and partnership can be fostered successfully. So how is this brought about when we talk about partnership as Boehringer Ingelheim? There is a whole range of different modes that are now pursued. And I think that's also reflective of a bit the conversation that we will have this afternoon. There are what closed or exclusive approaches, traditional approaches, basically, and on the other hand, also more contemporary, maybe open approaches as well. An example for an exclusive or closed approach would be, for instance, when we talk about bilateral partnerships, which actually still consists of ownership of many partnerships that we form, and these are about predefined terms and conditions, about a defined project that is defined upfront with a specified predefined partner as well. On the other hand, the open approaches, and that is what the remainder of my talk I will focus on, is a somewhat more modern approach, because at the onset actually is really only a question, and at the onset also we don't know yet who we may actually interact with when it comes down to the successful implementation of that research project. And so in this context, I was actually pretty much intrigued to read this recent report of the Physiological Society in UK that Tim alluded to already in the previous talks. And I looked here in particular again at top drivers and top barriers to knowledge exchange as basically outlined by the respondents to the survey. And I was intrigued that some of these aspects may have been fairly well taken almost as a blueprint years ago when the company Boehringer, when we thought about how we're going to address the difficulty in addressing the right partner. And it is actually interesting that the same issue is also reflected in academia and university as well. Also, we should not underestimate the perceived bureaucracy and inflexibility that often these partnerships bring about as well. And lack of time has been mentioned already by Tencel already. On the other hand, really on the motivating side, the ability to gain insights in their own research, the test the practicality application of the research, which are strong drivers, that help to reach outside and find somebody outside of its immediate network. And so this is why I think almost why we have set up our open innovation portal, OpenMe. So what is OpenMe all about? OpenMe is actually a website portal. It's a fully digital approach which allows scientists across the world to access well-defined selected preclinical tool compounds that we call molecules and use them for their own research. These molecules are provided free of charge, including shipment costs, without the need to enter any further intellectual property discussions. It's actually the next slide, Anwar, so that would be cool. And results can be used freely as well and used for their own publications. This is probably the most open approach that is feasible. And this, there are two additional projects on this aspect as well that are more, I would say, hybrid approaches, because they contain of an open approach and a closed approach. And here, a molecule or a biologic question is in the center of a question that is addressed and published in OpenMe, and only for a brief period of time. And during this brief period of time, scientists have the possibility to actually submit research proposals to this question, to come up with new biologic ideas for this molecule. All incoming ideas are actually reviewed by the jury, and upon selection are then pursued as bilateral close collaborationships with the selected scientists. And in particular, I still, at least on mine, I still see the enabler barrier slide on mine, and it's actually quite nice because it somehow addresses this difficulty to identify the right partner. Because here we're looking very open, and the right partner may fairly well sit really outside of our existing network of academics. And of course, especially also with the first program, and this is the Molecules to Order program. I'm now on slide number 6. People that colleagues are molecules, these are made available with a very low threshold, so they represent very little bureaucracy to obtain them, and of course scientists can use them freely in order to put their own research, test their own hypotheses, and get maybe well. So it's actually quite nice, and indeed the success of this program has meanwhile been verified by way over 1,000 individual offers from 50 countries. And just a glimpse into the open to and
it's back.
All right, I may have been lost, apologies. So, and it's interesting that actually these for proposals until June 7th. The program overall, although has been launched only last year, to actually by chance coincided with the COVID crisis, with 31 proposals overall. And just announced slide number 9 of my presentation, the UK actually being a strong contributor across. So a very nice outcome, and it tells us how avidly that is taken up, and we are very thankful for the contribution that we have obtained by the British researchers so far. And quote of her from Queen's University in Belfast, who outlined on one hand her role as business alliance manager to remove barriers, allowing knowledge exchange between industry and academic researchers, and on the other hand that OpenMe is indeed a welcoming, if you may want to say, entry point door to facilitate that exchange and to make it happen, and also overall as being. So to summarize, when we look once more at the enablers and barriers for knowledge exchange based on the report of the Physiological Society, I would say this is actually very insightful and environment as well, that you hope to agree with me that OpenMe is indeed a very good portal for knowledge exchange. And for this, I say thank you, everyone. I also thank the organizers once more for giving me the chance to speak this afternoon.
Thank you, Marcus. I think we've a few little bits on the way through as such. There's one bit in particular where I think you've said this is really interesting, and it cut out and you came back in again right at the actual date. So there are a couple of questions coming through for you already. I think that we'll pick up at the end. But hopefully, I think if we go on to Stuart now, and we'll hope the connection's a bit more stable for the questions shortly. Thank you.
So Marcus struggling with those modern challenges of bandwidth. I have to apologise. I'm struggling with the ancient challenge of losing my voice. So hopefully I will make it at the end of a few comments without going completely quiet. I don't want to spend too much time making remarks, and I think one of the really interesting things that ASTP and the Physiological Society have done is bring together a panel of the different actors who are really important in doing knowledge exchange. And actually what's really exciting to me is to have that conversation about those different perspectives of how we go about doing knowledge exchange. So not to delay that too much, I'll just give you a brief view from Oxford. So I should say who I am. I'm Stuart Wilkinson. I'm the lead, the knowledge exchange and impact team within the university. I also am an innovation fellow in in the university's newest college. And I have another hat, which is I'm the chair of the professional development committee at Praxis Oral. So those different perspectives from a college academic perspective, from a professional services perspective, and from the sort of UK sector, professional services sector, will hopefully be helpful. Just to give you a bit of background in Oxford, you may have heard of some of our research this year, but we're one of the largest UK research universities, the largest research university in the UK, and we're also a very diverse set of disciplines. So we cover everything from humanities through to medical sciences and everything in between. So we have a very broad view of knowledge exchange and of commercialization. And actually that is challenging but enriching in how we go about knowledge exchange in order to see it from those different discipline perspectives. And one of the things I hope we'll pick up in the discussion is the merits of understanding the inside out from a discipline, as well as that putting it in that context of other disciplines as well, and the importance of both of those. So I guess the other thing is that Oxford has been to make its research useful since the beginning of its academic journey. And in the more recent past, back in the early 80s, was very active in setting up a tech transfer office to do commercialization. then moving through into thinking about how we do knowledge transfer, as the UK jargon was at the time, and now are very involved in thinking about it as knowledge exchange more broadly. So not just about technology and not just about transfer, about all types of knowledge coming from research, and about exchanging that with the partners who will benefit, and ourselves benefiting from that sort of process of exchange. And to mirror that in the UK, the way that we measure and talk about knowledge exchange has also evolved. From the HEIs return, our annual data around knowledge exchange, every higher education institution in the UK does every year, to the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, which was published for the first time just a couple of weeks ago. And so we're increasingly trying to think about how do we help and support our academic colleagues, and as an institution do more of this kind of work and activity. And I guess one of the things I wanted to sort of spend a few moments on is to think about how knowledge exchange happens. And that word exchange is really important, about different partners coming together, whether it be the individual academic and the professional support that they may have close to them, whether it be the institution, or whether it be a sort of more sector-wide view. And by sector, you could slice that as a discipline specific or as a sort of professional services. So Physiological Society or praxis being really key elements and actors in how we go about doing knowledge exchange and doing more of it and promoting the activities that we have. I think one of the key things, as well as appreciating the different elements and actors, is some sense of critical mass. With my praxis hat, I'm aware that higher education institutions are very, very different. In Oxford, we have a challenge of size, would you believe, in that we have so many different moving parts. Trying to coordinate them is quite a challenge. But if I flip to my sister institution, Oxford Brookes University, another university in Oxford, which is much smaller in terms of research, they have a different challenge of only having a very few number of people involved supporting a lot of academics in this. So we have the advantage of specialism and of size, but the challenge of coordination. And much smaller HEIs have the challenge of trying to cover a range of bases, a range of different areas, which is not an inconsiderable task. So I think this issue of critical mass, whether that around a discipline or as an institution, is really, really important. And I think it was Tim that said the really useful thing is being able to pinpoint what actions and initiatives need to be taken at particular levels, but also to be inspired and to understand and to be informed by what's happening in other areas, whether that be other disciplines, other institutions, other territories around the world. And so that balance between pinpointing specific initiatives and learning from others. Just by way of an example, I remember having a conversation with colleagues in humanities who were sitting saying, looking at their colleagues in medical sciences saying, we can't do it like them. They can spin out companies and make lots of money, and obviously that's what all of their academics want. But we know we're not going to make lots of money out of this. We just want it to have fun. But we've looked at what they do and realised that the way to drive this is through giving status. That status may be a spin out, or it may just be a title. And so really drilling down from the humanities perspective and seeing what was happening in medical sciences, and really getting to grip with the issue about actually enabling and providing status and warmly welcoming and supporting their colleagues to go out and do knowledge exchange, inspired by a very different context in our medical sciences division. And actually it looped around again, and as Tim said, very few academics, it's solely about the income. Even our colleagues in medical sciences want to make a difference and want to change the world and have a positive benefit on the world. And so actually that driver is really, really important across the piece. But there are many, many ways to help academic colleagues to make that difference and to free up time and to support them and enable them to do that. So those are the thoughts I wanted to go into the conversation with. One, how do we work together as different actors at the society level, at the professional services sector level, at the institutional level? But how do we work together as different actors, as the sort of the two partners in knowledge exchange, as professional services, as academics, in making more knowledge exchange happen? And I think what the Physiological Society report does is really help us to drill down into one of those discipline areas and think about how we might support champions, inspire other early career researchers to take some steps down this route. And I think it's a really interesting window and insight into can be done to make more research have a greater impact.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stuart. I'll just start something, and indeed all speakers. I think that really has just been, again, I have got questions, and I have questions because I'm the chair and I was involved in the report. I should know all of this. And there's still all the things that I'm sort of jumping into my mind. But perhaps if I give a quick sort of summary just of some of the points I took away from that while people are thinking about questions. And as I say, do please put them in the chat as such if you've got things that are either for questions or for the whole panel as such. But I mean, excuse me. Tamsin talked a bit about the building the evidence base as such, which is something which is very much close to my heart from my days as a public official, when very much we spent a lot of time saying, how do we justify public funding for this, public investment in knowledge exchange? Not just saying, is it a good idea, but, how is it a good idea alongside more traditional research, teaching funding, or other pressure on the public sort of purse. So making the case that this is an investment that actually does have a good return is something which is important. But I think that also happens within institutions. And I doubt you spend much time telling many of the audience here that, making the case within your institution that this stuff is actually worthwhile and, putting some resource in will get a lot more out is also a significant point. So this level of perhaps more sphered evidence can be used both at the institutional level to make the case for knowledge exchange in terms of resources, and indeed at the national level. Tim, I think, again, had a brilliant sort of synopsis of the report. Part of the fact that we didn't know what we were going to find going in, we genuinely, this was sort of interesting for us as well. And we came out with this figure of 11% of knowledge exchange being related to physiology, which by no means do we mean that exactly 11% was all physiology. What we mean is we contributed to that proportion of it. And I think, again, as was already mentioned, you wouldn't want to try and do this across the entire spectrum top down, because you'd probably find the answers add up to more than 100%. That's not what we were going for. What we were going is saying to people like me 14 months ago, who maybe thought that physiology was just the old word for medicine, they began to change the way we think and understand that, as we heard in some of the anecdotal evidence from KE offices, that a call will come in and that sounds a bit medical related, so we'll send it across to the health lot. But actually what they were after was something physiological. And that's not just a sense of how swiftly you can deal with that, but that's, again, dealing with the time issue on both sides. Industrial partners and academics don't have this time to be umming and ahhing around. The quicker you can actually specify what the query is and get them in touch with the right person, that can build that relationship and, in fact, might make it happen when it may have stalled previously. So I think that's part of why we're saying that, yes, there's a huge benefit here potentially in terms of resource and investment, but it will take a bit of time in the first place. The fact that Marcus, again, was recognising similar problems from the industrial side, I found that very interesting. In fact, there's been a sort of similar journey from the previous model of having a very defined project and defined partners to having a little bit more of a risk-based approach as such in the open innovation, sort of a bit of a see what happens. And I think that all of us have spent a very long time saying that's always brilliant when it works, but it's very, very difficult to justify when you're talking about the actual resource allocation models. You say, I had this great conversation at a conference. Well, that's brilliant, but you can't spend your entire career going to conferences and waiting for that moment to come through. There has to be some sort of balance. But I think, again, as was picked up particularly by Stuart towards the end, the more we can have these conversations with the right people in the right room together without having an immediate axe to grind as such, we can actually focus down on where that sort of pressure point is and what the recommendations can be for either side and how we can address those, how we can ameliorate those. Again, sort of finally, perhaps just that sort of point that some of this is going to be a trade-off. I mean, I think everyone's going to agree that if we had blank checks and more resource and more time, we'd all do lots more KE and lots more of this kind of KE. But is there a question of saying, well, perhaps things aren't quite that easy, and are you going to have to stop doing something to do more of this? And that's not probably what we're arguing. We are saying that actually it's not a question of it's either or. We're just saying it's a question of actually have these conversations early on, get the right training in place, and say not every university needs to be focused on physiology, but those that do have that department, worth doing. Others, it may be engineering, it may be humanities, it may be philosophy, a number of other elements where that can be important. But coming back to that single point about saying this is a really good way of translating, not just for the public, but for government, what it is we're doing, because people don't necessarily think in terms of the academic disciplines or indeed economic sectors, but they do think about issues, such as aging, as we've mentioned, or artificial intelligence is another one I like to point out as being, something everyone agrees is massively important. And of course, yes, the scientists, the mathematicians are very going to be central to that. But without linguists, without philosophers working on those projects, AI is not going to be which it could be. So the sense of saying that perhaps, this is a way of first drilling down the discipline specific levels and then saying, actually, this is why we need to have all these things recognized. Otherwise, we will not actually approach these grand challenges in the most effective way. And these are not national issues, these are global issues. So again, with what we're trying to do, if we can reach out across Europe across to the States and beyond, this is a thing where we feel these networks can come together and actually basically really make a contribution and make everyone's life easier, and perhaps try and, you know, soften some of that time pressure that we're seeing. So that's my first quick take as such from the conversation so far. I can't see anything else jumping up into the questions at the moment, or the chat, unless I'm missing anything. I've got something from Laura, in fact. That's an interesting question. So, in terms of what's the most persuasive way to address this? I know we've already talked about sort of progression and reward. Certainly, that's one of the things in the UK has been recognised. But I mean, some are incentivized by hard cash, certainly in terms of the inventions, but we should also mention perhaps the fact that it does support research and teaching and other elements of your academic activity more broadly. It shouldn't be that you're doing KE instead of something else. You're doing KE which supports other things, would be my view. But if I can ask Tim first, perhaps, to come in and say, again, what would you say are the best ways to tell this sort of story to your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, as I sort of alluded to there, Adrian, I mean, I think the issue actually, you know, when you sort of look at the academic standards for different criteria within the universities, you know, knowledge exchange might only be one of sort of 30 to 40 criteria for academics. And I think it's not always clear, particularly for our earlier career academics, that knowledge exchange actually links into many of those other criteria. And so I think that's something that we need to be promoting with our sort of early career academics in particular, in terms of the links between knowledge exchange and many other areas of many other areas that they're involved with. And certainly one of the concerns I would have in general is that, you know, when you start a new academic position, I've mentored quite a lot of academics now over the years. And, you know, they're coming in and they're getting a lot of training. And I think this is pretty standard across a lot of the universities in the UK, that they get a lot of training around teaching. There's actually a requirement for them to complete a teaching certificate. There's a requirement for them to undertake a certain number of research-based courses, but they're not really getting any in-depth training around knowledge exchange. And I think if that was happening, that would help to drive a lot more knowledge exchange activity, you know, throughout an academic's career. So those are a couple of things that I think would need to happen.
Thanks. I think Stuart's nodding. I was going to bring him in next as well. So particularly perhaps, you know, you've already made a point about the fact that different institutions, the Oxford and Oxford Brookes, have perhaps similar challenges but different ways of addressing them. So again, you know, from picking up from what Tim said, do you think that this is something which could be done fairly generically, or do you think it's going to still require a very specific approach for the type of institution we're talking about?
So I think it's complex to sort of start off like that. I mean, I think I came from a conversation this morning with senior colleagues thinking about reward and recognition that Tim just identified. And that is a really knotty problem to solve. In order to how to level the playing field between the different demands on academics. So in terms of long term, I think that's something we should be addressing. But I think it's a long term issue because it is so knotty. I think in the medium term, I think Tim's exactly right. How do we upskill both professional services and academic colleagues to do this easier, more quickly, more effectively? And I think that skills piece is a sort of medium term sort of activity that we can address. In the short term, which is only the start, and I acknowledge that, actually a lot can be done by just inspiring people and showing what is possible. And I think that's where Praxis and the Physiological Society have great opportunities to tell stories, to go, actually, it is possible. These are the kind of things you can do, and inspire people to have a go, if you like. And I think a lot of the comms around there actually opens people's eyes and enables people to see how they can do that in an effective way alongside all the demands on their time. So I think great inroads can be made around that, saying, actually, look, you could do this. But I think Tim's right, skills are really important, thinking about how do we appropriately upskill and support our academics to have this as part of their toolkit. How do you approach businesses and how to sort of develop partnerships. But then longer term, I think we do really need to sort of level the playing field and say, if you do this kind of thing, you will be valued and you are important in a similar sort of way.
I mean, at this point, it would be great if we had someone from a training organisation perhaps that could come in at this point and talk a little bit about what might be available, or whether or not there are particular things we could do for ECR. Perhaps Tamsin, if you'd like to maybe mention.
I'm treading on Stuart's toes here, actually, because he is the head of our training committee. So, but I would just say, from practical point of view, we don't generally train academics, and that's partly because, you know, it's partly resources in ourselves. You know, we started off. We were founded on the basis of needing to train the brokers, and that's what we've continued doing. But it's not to say that academics can't come on our courses, but they may find that they don't quite feel they fit into the particular conversations we have through our training. It is something that I am seeing more and more requests for, you know, from individual universities who are interested in understanding how they can incentivise their academics to do more knowledge exchange. And I think it's about education, isn't it? It's what is knowledge exchange? How do you do it? Where am I going to find, you know, a mentor or somebody who inspires me, somebody whose example I can follow? And what kind of knowledge do I need to take the next steps? And if you work with a very large knowledge exchange office, it can be hard to, you know, to manage both the external demand and building of that internal support as well. I think it's a question, you know, it's something that practice all needs to think about. And it's not, the Intellectual Property Office in the UK has done quite a lot of training for researchers recently. They've launched a whole stream of resources aimed at early career academics in particular. It's certainly something we need to think about, I think. I would say reward. I'm a big fan of the fellowship model because I think that does buy your time. And I had a very interesting conversation a couple of years ago with a group who were the Environment Research Council KE Fellows. And not only did having that grant give them the time to explore what knowledge exchange meant in that particular research base, it created a small network, practice-based work of knowledge exchange, a peer group, if you like. So I know NERC has recently reviewed that programme and it's running again now. Of course, that's competitive. It's a small cohort. It's not available to everyone. The learned societies can help as well and provide support because they can do that fellowship activity as well.
Stuart, do you want to say? Yes, please.
So on the skills front, I think again, I think there's some general stuff to be done to support both professional services colleagues and academics to get started. I think one of the challenges is then how that plugs into an institutional context. So who does what in the institution varies quite a lot. And so you can provide nationwide or region-wide training, but you do then have to appreciate that in a particular context, it may be that that's down to this person or that's down to this person. And so you do need that sort of embedded into that institutional context. But societies can have a great role in terms of providing that start and giving a sort of overview of the different contexts that academics are working in. But inevitably, it comes down to professional services in that institution to go, well, these are the policies and processes that we have to follow here. So I think that there's a double level on that needs to be taken into account. I think the other thing to bear in mind is it's not an individual game. It may feel very much like that from an individual academic perspective, but if you zoom out and look at it at an institutional perspective, then often partnerships will be very interesting when you take that view. It's dependent on those individuals who are personally committed to their research and to that impact. But it's really interesting when you have very serendipitous partnerships across the university who might not just be interested in sports science, but also be interested in management and business or engineering. So apologies, an ice cream van in the background. Monday afternoon. So that kind of institutional level can bring benefit and value, as well as thinking the individual academic.
Tim, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point as well that I think when thinking about training around knowledge exchange, I think, we're talking about providing training for early career researchers. But of course, what an early career researcher can do in terms of knowledge exchange activity will be you know, more limited perhaps than somebody who's a more established researcher who's been working in the field like myself for 20 years, where we've got that track record, and it makes it a lot easier for us to, you know, to collaborate with industry. And you know, what I tend to see certainly here is that yes, our early career researchers are involved in knowledge exchange activity, but it's more around public engagement and that type of activity. And then as they move through, as they become more established, that's when you start seeing contract research, collaborative research, spin-outs being developed. And so I think there's certainly an argument here that the training that's provided should be tailored according to whereabouts in the career path a particular academic is at.
I think Tim's right, and actually the skills are transferable in some respects for how you actively engage with a public audience. So how do you actively engage with an industrial partner? Now that then works out slightly differently, but it's the same core sort of skills that sort of lead between the two. I think the other thing, it's not just about skills and network, and building a network takes time, and there are ways to do that. There are shortcuts, whether that be through learning societies, whether that be through time in the job, whether that be through attending conferences. So it's skills and network which are absolutely important to broker out those partnerships.
I wonder, again, if it's possible, as we've already mentioned, it's the sort of narrative, making sure we sort of get the language right for this, because I think, you know, personally, when I started this a long time ago, the word exploitation was a bad word. You know, when I thought about exploitation, I thought about people exploited, and that's not something you want. And then you kind of get into this area and think, well, hang on, if we're not exploiting knowledge, that's a bad thing. We should be exploiting knowledge, particularly if it's been publicly funded. It's there to make our lives better. So that's one way of doing it. And I wonder whether that's part of this sense of saying, well, if you're an early career researcher, public engagement sounds like a great thing to be doing. It sounds like the right thing. If you've taken some public money, surely public engagement is a good thing to do. But commercial activity, is that what I should be doing, given I've been publicly funded? And from my point of view, you say, well, look, you know, the NHS doesn't have a manufacturing wing. You know, if you want to actually cure diseases, you are going to have to work with the private sector to make sure that actually people can take these medicines and use this equipment and such. So actually, when we talk about knowledge exchange in the UK, half of the entire value and half of what's used in funding comes from non-commercial sources. It comes from National Health Service and from other government and so forth. But again, when you make that comparison to the States, of course, where there's less public health, then almost any interaction will be a public interaction, which means that some of us who are bean counters end up having to try and pull it all together just to make sure we're making fair comparisons, even though we do understand that actually, certainly massive amounts of value are not about necessarily simply in terms of helping a commercial partner, but saying that this is a way of getting knowledge out from the research base to benefit people's lives. Do you want to come back into it, please?
Yeah, and just to pick up on the language point, I think that's really important. So how you describe these activities and the language that's used can be quite discipline specific and can be a turn off to certain disciplines, but make complete sense to others. And so I think, again, to that pinpointing the discipline, finding the language that is most relevant, most acceptable, and most energizing for each is really important. And again, from Oxford's experience, you know, we've gone through a long process of trying to find a common language across a variety of disciplines that everybody buys into. And some of that's difficult because people have to change their understanding of what entrepreneurship is or what commercialization is. One of my biggest joys was when a colleague in humanities, who'd spent 3 years correcting me if I said businesses, to say businesses and other organisations, then turned around and called the National Trust, a big charitable organisation in the UK, a business. Without dropping a beat. But I think that process of coming up with a combined language, an acceptable language and understanding is really important, both in a university, but then also with partners.
I mean, I think I absolutely agree with that. The one defence I used to myself for being slow at this was the fact that it took 30 years to draft Frascati, another 30 years to update it. So again, you know, we've been doing this for 20 years. We've made a bit of progress, but we're not quite there yet. And that does loop round again to the other point about what we're talking about here, I think, is the most useful of this sort of bottom-up approach from practitioners, people who understand what they're talking about. But there is that point to say that when government gets involved, it's going to want to have a more simplistic way of solving this. What's the answer so we can move on? And that's why I'm worried. You know, we are talking about innovation, and I think there's quite a lot more to do to understand this before we can really say, right, that's it. We've nailed it. We know what we're talking about by these words. So I think, in defence of letting a little bit of wiggle room maintain for a while we flesh out exactly how we understand knowledge exchange, is probably okay. But that's not to say that, yes, we shouldn't be able to explain what we already know a bit better.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking on the language point, you know, the trouble is, I suppose, we have these three missions in the UK, don't we? The teaching, the written, and knowledge exchange, and there's still, you know, certainly the knowledge exchange is still kind of, it's still relatively new compared to the other two, and it has got this particular kind of language. It's been helped a little bit by the impact in the research framework, but impact is quite the same as knowledge exchange all the time. And then we talk about innovation, and then we talk about research and development. And so, you know, that's often language coming from external partners, and then about knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer, depending on who we're talking to. So it can get very complicated for somebody coming new to it. And I don't think there is a single definition that we can all point to and agree on. I think it would be very hard to achieve. And as Stuart said, you know, the diversity and the nuances of that language is something which I think build the richness. You know, you don't want people to feel left out because they don't agree with the way something's described. I would just say on the public point, I never used to think of public engagement as knowledge exchange because a different team did it. So, but what I would say was as those two teams, two internal teams, university I worked with, themselves developed a better relationship, we were able to see the skills developed through public engagement, not least the confidence to stand in front of the external audience, explain all this fairly late term. They were very useful, but then putting into more formal context of knowledge exchange. And it's often where we go to kind of see, you know, just find new people to involve in our knowledge exchange conversations, particularly when we're doing kind of industry showcases, which we can call public engagement. You know, so I think there is a strong link between public engagement and knowledge exchange, but I don't, as a part of knowledge exchange, but I don't think it's been particularly well explored. Should be interesting to see.
No, I would go along with that. I mean, again, back from when I was running the survey, say, all those years ago as such, you know, you'd see the occasional sort of big jump in an institution's sort of metric somewhere as such, and you'd phone to say, you know, where's this come from? Hopefully it wasn't a typo. And very frequently you'd sort of find out that actually, you know, we've ex-professor or ex-academic who's been doing this thing for the last 5 or 10 years because they find it personally interesting. And they didn't bother telling us about it because they thought they might be in trouble because it wasn't part of the original, you know, your progressive for teaching, research and KE. So that's something else that we've already talked about, is that where there is a model to be able to directly incentivize and reward staff for this level of knowledge exchange, you tend to find that actually suddenly people will sort of start talking about things they've been doing for a while. They didn't even realize what you meant by this, either because, as you say, they thought it was all about patenting and commercialization, or because they just thought it wasn't of interest. And again, going back to the sort of academic work, it's that point about, you know, why involve yourself in knowledge exchange? Well, it gives me new insights into my research and gives me new ways to approach my teaching material. And I think that's something else in the UK which has been relevant for particularly some of the institutions that aren't necessarily quite so research intensive, is to say that, you know, attracting students is a really important part of their model. That is the fundamental and primary form of knowledge transfer from academia to the rest of the world, is by teaching students. And I think the idea of saying, you know, look at these world examples of things that myself and my colleagues have been working on, as opposed to simply relying on textbook examples and things like that, is a way not necessarily just of engaging students and making them more employable, but also having that culture change. So when that generation of students become the next generation of research managers and buyers and so forth, they wouldn't have to do what I did, which is to go through the learning process, go, oh, hang on, so I can go back onto the university and still ask questions. You know, I thought that once I got my degree, I was full up with knowledge and that was it. I had to go off into the workforce now. Obviously, I spent a large amount of time going back to universities and asking what's going on, how do I do this? And it's that sense of learning you kind of want for perhaps other parts of the economy. So again, I'm borrowing from the lifelong learning argument, but it's both in terms of education and in terms of problem solving, consultancy, and some of the things which are the softer elements of knowledge exchange.
And I think to pick up on the sort of relationship of public engagement with research, but other sort of modes of knowledge exchange, I think depending on the scale you're looking at, they all come into play. So if you're just a researcher with a piece of research, it may be that only 1 or 2 modes of impact may be open to you. But if you're working on a program that is trying to change industrial sectors, then actually addressing the public at the time as addressing regulators at the same and policy, at the same time as addressing industry, is absolutely critical for the success and the sort of the growth of that new sector. So by way of example, thinking of quantum computing, a lot of work going in that area, all of those things are required, but it may be required by an individual researcher working on one little bit. But holistically, we need to work with all of those different actors in order to have a successful impact or exchange of knowledge or build a new sector in those sort of areas. So again, I think it depends which length you're looking at, whether it be individual, institutional, or sort of sector-wide, of how you need to engage with those different modes of knowledge.
I think we've seen from UKRI, the UK sort of national body for this, that they are looking to engage far more with user groups, specialist groups, and indeed learner societies. And I was just wondering, if I could ask sort of the audience if is that something that works better elsewhere? Because I mean, we have a pretty good relationship in places, but there's not necessarily the sort of the formal interaction. And I wonder whether anyone else is already sort of doing more of this. Anyone else who already has societies involved in sort of research policy and indeed perhaps even some of decision making. I mean, if it's either put a yes or a no in chat, or simply if it's not something that's relevant, we can go on. But certainly, as far as this seems to be, it's timely. The UK government wants to understand how to make more intelligent investments. The learner societies want to be able to show how they can actually produce this value for their members and indeed for the economy more broadly. So again, I think that's something which it seems to be a good idea, but I wonder if there's good practice elsewhere that we can learn from. Not a huge array of things coming in, but I'll guess that might be something we can follow up with a bit later on and such. It'd be interesting to see what at the actual conference, whether we can talk about that point a bit further. We've got some questions about social sciences coming through. I think that's already been addressed. That's useful. Again, I mean, that's another example I use. I've mentioned AI already, but video games is the other one that the UK talks about quite a lot. And over my career, it's gone from the thing that people snigger about, so what, are you really talking about computer games, that Pac-Man thing, to eventually start to understand that when there are hundreds of millions of people spending a large amount of their time and resource doing this, that maybe there's something more to video games than there is than they thought. But it's not just about a graphics engine or a physics engine that drives that. It's about an artist who creates a world you want to spend time in. Something that's actually engaging, and it's about somebody with a humanities background making the game actually fun to play. If it's too difficult, you don't want to play it. If it's too easy, you get no challenge from it. So again, in terms of where the UK brings together some of these examples, it works really well. It seems to work seamlessly in certain sectors, I think, as Stuart says, but they're not all going to lend themselves to that level of ease, if you like. But for the most part, we all have a sense that it all benefit from doing a bit more of this.
And I think that's often one of the really exciting parts of knowledge exchange, is having an external organisation come and say, we want to understand this thing or this topic area better. And, with a fairly broad inquiry and the role of the broker in taking different parts of the university that they might have thought was relevant to them before. That's quite a hard thing to do if you're up against pressures of time. But if you can, if all parties can afford that time to do some of that exploratory work, I think that's where often the richest types of knowledge exchange happen. It's not necessarily the point that are obvious, and really somebody with the time to dig into a university faculty membership probably do themselves. The value of the broker is in covering things which aren't obvious outside.
I'm just really hoping Marcus' signal's going to come back in just for that point. I know he would have missed it to summer, because I thought exactly that would be a good point for him to come in on. And perhaps if he either really can hear me or say more generally, but that's certainly something which, again, putting my hat back on as the sort of public official, but the more you hear that from business, the better. So again, it's one of those things that obviously ourselves working in education, we would talk about the value of the things we do, because we would say that, wouldn't we, as such. But again, if you can sort of talking to your partners, say just next time you're talking to government, just mention how useful it was that we had these things called universities, mention how valuable those contributions are. That's actually, it's a very useful sort of message that can get through to the top levels of government much more swiftly than some of the stuff that we do does. But again, since Marcus can't hear me or see me, I will just say that in his voice and claim that he would agree with me anyway.
Maybe Tim can comment on whether all the partners that he works with are they all organisations which you would expect to identify your particular expertise, Tim, or have you ever been surprised by a particular partnership that you've been involved in?
I think in our case, it's been very much the larger pharma companies, so it's not been surprising to us. I think the issue is that we don't always know what those pharma companies are working on, and I think that's why, there are times when it can be different pharma companies working in different areas, so without sort of saying which pharma companies are involved, say years ago it might have been one big pharma company, then they've closed down that department, more recently, and then a different pharma companies sort of come in, and so it's not really surprised us as such, but it's been difficult to identify what the different companies are doing at any given time to know, which ones we should be speaking to and which ones we should be trying to link in with, and whether they would be interested. So that's part of the problem. I think actually the Boehringer model, this OpenMe program, it's been really wonderful in terms of, certainly in our area, in terms of breaking down that barrier, because we know what drugs they've been developing, and we can then come forward with proposals based upon those particular drugs that, looking at repurposing or, so it gives opportunities that I think weren't there previously.
Thanks. Something interesting question from Laura about sort of what's the ideal way in which we could put together a panel for this sort of deep dive. And obviously, I think the quick answer to that is to look at the report, and that's the perfect panel you could use, with the particular need, of course, to have a consultant who has the view across the entire history of the UK system. I think my first point would be that it is what we keep saying, the learned societies. They are I think they are a good sort of agnostic sort of focal point for these things. They are perhaps slightly more geared towards the academic sector, but again, the Physiological Society has members from not just the UK, but across the world, and again from industry and academia, and people who've moved back and forward as such. So you obviously need to have both sides of that divide. Having somebody who's understanding of public policy as well, and of course of the professions, seems to make sense. But within reason, I think, it strikes me that learned societies are a good sort of common ground for which these groups can be focused around. Is that any other thoughts from the group?
I would just say that, some universities have self-organised themselves to do these kind of case-specific activities themselves. So I'm thinking about the Connected Capability Fund projects that have been funded through the UK, and Stuart's colleagues in the aspect social sciences, CCF in particular, where that's been about, again, kind of recognising the contribution of the social sciences, but also very much the potential of the social sciences to participate in knowledge exchange and specifically in commercialisation. So that has been an interesting project where they've gathered together the actors and they've done the deep dive and they're presenting it back to various stakeholders. And practically all has been involved in differing ways through that. But that's an interesting model to look at in the UK.
And in fact, many of the CCS have a slightly different take. So there's the UK Spine Connected Capability Fund, CCF, which is looking at healthy aging and pharmaceutical treatments. And the idea with all of those CF projects is to build the network of institutions involved, to add institutions to those networks and build a national capability. I think to the question in the chat, I think some definition is important at some point. And the trick is not being too defined, not being too broad. So trying to convene, and I think learned societies have a real opportunity there to convene a range of interested parties is really important, but that diversity is important too. So making sure it's the different types of HEI, higher education institutions, but also the different types of industry and industrial partners. There's a real skill in identifying a diverse group of entities that want to engage, whilst also making it small enough to make progress. And that requires a bit of skill in terms of finding that sort of topic and area where people can gather around and make progress.
I think, that's part of the interest, isn't it? So we're even though if we're talking about similar things from different angles, it's going to look different in the language actually, work in all those contexts, which is, I think, a point that Marcus is making in the chat as well. So you can obviously hear us, even if he's not with us in face as such. But, I wonder if this is something that we might be able to explore sort of more during the actual conference as such. If we'll have a virtual presence there, and between now and then we could do a bit of thinking with, sort of where the language might sort of need to go to and who the right people are to have those conversations. I'd be interested, whether or not that might be a good opportunity just for people to stop by and have a look at what our work in progress is, and we could talk about something over that time. I know that I would often run off into the detail of what do you actually mean by research as opposed to collaborative research. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about much more about the mechanisms, aren't we, in terms of why people understand this to be important, and getting away from probably some of the old language that they do know, because the phrase ivory tower still gets printed in the press in this country, despite the fact that it hasn't been true for a very long time, or at least not in my view. So yes, I wonder whether that's something else that we could actually add on to some of the work we're looking at, is to say that we won't finish the question, but we might be able to move it forward a bit. Again, further apologies from Marcus for us to so he has been just caught out by the gremlins, I'm afraid, but yes, he has been with us all the way through and keeping an eye on us as such. If there are any final points from the panel that I can invite just now? Final observations, final answers. You haven't come up with the definition just on the way through.
You just made me think of one thing, Adrian, and we haven't really talked about the different models of knowledge exchange, different modes that came out in the report. But I think the modes of engagement broadly follow the national picture in terms of which ones are most common. But of course, it's having that understanding that knowledge exchange it's not just about the commercialization or collaborative research. There are things like consultancy, which is for an individual wanting to do something with your know-how based on your research. Then most universities can help you to have that kind of more independent form of knowledge exchange, or it can be a more team-based consultancy. But I can see Joe wanting to come in, so.
I have the school run in a second, but I think the report itself is really interesting, and Tim gave us an insight into some of the sort of ideas that will be implemented, I hope, and it will be interesting to see how the fellows and also Bill's conversation that we had, picking up on those, because fundamentally I think all of the actors involved in this conversation and the broader group that represents want to see more impact, make more of a difference from physiological research in its broadest sense. So I think I look forward to the outworking of those implementations. After what I think was quite a challenge to grapple with the data, but I think a worthwhile challenge.
Absolutely. Any final points, Tim, I can put you on the spot for?
No, well, I was just going to make the point that, I suppose I'm going back to kind of driving knowledge exchange around, we're talking about making sure that knowledge exchange is embedded into promotion criteria and so on, but one of the things I think that will need to be defined more clearly is what we regard as successful knowledge exchange. You often see, these lines engaged in successful knowledge exchange activity. Well, so actually, as an academic sitting on a promotions panel, what are we defining as successful knowledge exchange? And I think that may be a question that needs to be discussed more within the knowledge exchange community and with academics as well.
I would say immediately that's one of those questions that needs to be understood at different levels. Between the institution needs to be able to take some sort of such, whereas we need to be a little bit careful about how that conversation is had in terms of public money. But it's been something which has been said for a number of years, back to actually when Lord Sainsbury was Minister for Science, that we need to have the National Audit Office appreciating that sometimes risks are not going to come where you want them to, and that people will still like to try. So again, there's a sense of risk aversion, particularly during times when public funding is tight, is an issue. But if we give up on it, then we put ourselves back by decades in terms of the knowledge exchange, as you say. So I think that is something else which we do. And we can understand it, in the two different levels, at the operational mechanical level and indeed at the strategic policy level. I was just thinking again on the way through, you frequently sort of come down to these, well, I can certainly talk about the overall volumes of knowledge exchange and investment in terms of the calculations, but actually the thing that happened last year was it was University of Birmingham who put together a bunch of material on the web for people who were going to have trouble exercising in lockdown. So my mother, who could no longer leave the house and no longer go out for walks and so forth, I was straight round there, and we were using academic research from Birmingham based on the physiology to make sure that she wasn't going to go too crazy and get too bored during what was an unprecedented time. So it's one of those sort of things that, like I say, for all we talked about, and all we talked about the value of knowledge exchange, actually, making my mum a bit happy last year was something else that I did really value this year. So thank you again, Physiology, and thank you again, Knowledge Exchange, on that basis. And I think we have just literally come to 4:30. So with unless there are any other further major questions in the chat, I will say thank you hugely to all our panel members. It's been really, really interesting. And thank you again to Laura and Arno for hosting us in this first bit of the session we're going to have. And hopefully we'll be able to actually build on this in the conference and make sure that the next time you hear from us, we'll have some clear answers.
That just sounds excellent. Honestly, I can just echo it was amazing what you managed to share. I mean, the work that was put together in the report was amazing, but also being able to share the key messages so well this afternoon, I think, with the audience has also been hugely appreciated. So I must say, I said at the start, I see this as the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So I am certainly looking forward to not just the conference, but I think, one of the things I think about I saw Stuart has many hats. I think everybody has many hats, but if I just wear one hat today, which is an ASD hat, which is about networking and connecting people, and ideally making sure that all the really useful information that is constantly being generated is in fact, made available and shared as much as possible with as many possible people. So this example of what started out, I know the Physiological Society is international, but clearly the focus of the work of this particular report, if we can sort of magnify and resonate, have the impact resonate much more widely. I was really surprised. I don't know if you had a chance to see the participants, but we've got South Africa, we have Canada, we have Slovenia. We have so many diverse participants here that, I think this is obviously an excellent report and will really kind of continue to inspire us. I think it's both inspiring because it contains essentially new ideas, but I also think that one of the strengths of this group of actors is the power of the message, because it is validated by really those who are active, those who are experienced on all sides of the spectrum. So I think it's really incumbent on us to give up some time every now and again, as we've just done this afternoon, take you from your other day jobs and your mainstream activities to continue to roll that out. And I think as the ASTP, we're really delighted with Praxis Oral and the other national associations just to see how we can leverage continued awareness of this kind of information gathering, because I think we all accept it is not a straightforward, linear process, this knowledge exchange journey. So if we can share examples and how to make it easier and better understood and so on, the more we do that, the better we will be, I think, delivering for everybody. So, yeah, thank you so much. And I don't know, we'll jump into the lounge. Anybody who wants to hang around, some of us will certainly be available. Any of you are most welcome. And otherwise, I look forward to hearing some of you again at the end of May, if not before. So, thank you so much once again, everybody. Thank you very much.